Good evening. My name is Sanshin Oberholtzer. I'm the resident priest and guiding teacher at the Joseph Priestley Zen Sangha. We're part of Empty Moon Zen. 78 years ago today, people in Hiroshima, Japan were gazing up at the summer sky, thankful that they'd been largely spared the incessant bombing their countrymen had been experiencing, not realizing what fate and a single B-29 had in store for them in 3 days' time. And so, as we close in on the Japanese celebration of Obon, a time to remember our ancestors, and a time to remember the dead, this evening I think it's appropriate that we revisit the Gata of Atonement. In the translation used by the San Francisco Zen Center and adopted by the Joseph Priestley Zen Sangha, it goes, "All my ancient twisted karma, from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion, born through body, speech, and mind, I now fully avow." I like that. Ancient and twisted karma. And doesn't this describe the world we find ourselves in? Confused threads, ancient threads, tangled, chaotic, hard to trace, often hard to face. So let me retell a story ancient and twisted, a story from the Upaya Kausala Sutta, an early Mahayana sutra. Early, ancient, twisted. Once, in a far distant age, in one of his countless earlier lives, the Buddha, before he became the Buddha, was the captain of a trading ship, sailing home from a successful voyage with 500 happy and satisfied merchants, and with all of their profits aboard. There was also a passenger plotting silently the murder of those merchants, who intended to kill them all in their sleep and seize all of that bounty for himself. The plan was revealed to the future Buddha in his sleep. One of those powers granted a bodhisattva, and he was left to ponder what to do about this. He could simply allow the events to unfold, but the end result would be not simply that 500 merchants would die, but that the murderer would spend thousands of eons in hell for his crime. But should the Buddha tell the merchants, they would set upon the potential killer, slay him, and then themselves spend countless eons in hell. Not wanting either result, and seeing only one way to resolve this, the Buddha took a spear and killed the passenger himself, knowing that that act would condemn him to a seeming eternity in hell. And this is our life. Tragedy consists of often facing nothing but bad choices, and yet having to act. We all have to act. We all have to choose, and in choosing, we all have to accept the consequences of those acts, no matter who we are. You, me, the Buddha, Harry S. Truman signing the order to drop that bomb. Bai Zhang, in case 2 of the Gateless Gate, once famously saved a fox with the turning words, "Even a fully enlightened being is subject to the law of cause and effect." The Buddha saw this with clear eyes, picked up the spear, and did his time in hell. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children died in that initial attack on those 2 unsuspecting Japanese cities, with effects and casualties lingering on for decades. Here in the United States, men, women, and children downwind from the Trinity testing site live with the effects of fallout from that first test bomb to this day. And so the war ended. And with the surrender, the Japanese homeland was spared the devastation of a conquest which, given the events of the prior invasion of Okinawa, where over 100,000 civilians died, either in combat or through suicide, would have been devastating both for the soldiers on both sides, but especially for the civilian population. Karma ripples out like wavelets from a pebble tossed into a pond and touches us in ways we often don't suspect. My father dropped out of high school in the middle of World War II and attempted to join the army. When they rejected him as being too scrawny, he went next door and joined the Marines, who seemed more accommodating. He spent the war in the South Pacific as a tail gunner and a dive bomber. My stepfather left college here in Pennsylvania and was commissioned an officer in the Marines. He was assigned to the division that was going to be sent in the first wave of an invasion of the Japanese home islands. But for the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but for the immediate deaths of close to 200,000 civilians, the war might have lasted for years. My father might have flown missions over Japan. My stepfather might have landed on what would have been the fiercely defended beaches of the Japanese islands. One or the other or both might have died. And in that case, I might well have never been born. Hundreds of thousands of other Japanese soldiers and civilians might not have lived. The course of history would have been altered in ways we cannot imagine. But surely, the course of history was altered in that blinding flash on August 6th, 1945. David Loy has asked the question of whether we shouldn't talk of a kind of collective karma. And so it seems the causes and conditions of those crewmen at the U.S. Air Base in Tinian in the Western Pacific, of those physicists in the Manhattan projects, these have spread out, enveloping all of us. My mother's favorite cousin finished his PhD in physics while at Los Alamos. While working on that first test atomic bomb, his children's birth certificates all list a post office box in Los Alamos as their birthplace. A good and decent man, he worked with Robert Oppenheimer, who, watching the first nuclear blast at the Trinity site near Los Alamos, reached out for the words of the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." And our world was destroyed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the Last Judgment. A new world born of the deaths of all those innocent men, women, and children. That ancient, twisted karma reaches out and touches all of us. How many of us grew up in the 50s in the shadow of nuclear holocaust? How many of us crouched, as we now know, fruitlessly, under school desks as sirens wailed? How many awaited Armageddon, listening to reports coming out over network television about the Cuban Missile Crisis? These were the direct descendants of that first week in August 1945, the consequences of those fateful bombs. The threads of that unfolding karma have touched not simply our lives, but the course of our nation and of the world right down to the present day. Just ask anyone in Hawaii who awoke a few years back to the thankfully false news that a Korean missile was incoming. And let us not forget, let us remember the other deaths the far greater numbers of civilian deaths in the fire bombings of Tokyo, the unimaginable suffering of the people of China, the rape of Nanjing, the oppression of the Koreans and the Manchurians. But on this week, it all comes down to those men, women, and children of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the dead, the injured, those lingering on with the after effects of radiation poisoning, some simply left as shadows burned onto walls. All my ancient twisted karma, from beginningless greed, hatred, and ignorance, born of my body, mouth, and thought. Now I atone for it all. May we remember, may we be at one.